I bought a desk at a garage sale a few weeks ago, and I still can't shake what happened after. I needed something sturdy and cheap since I'm on a tight student budget. I found this sale in a nearby neighborhood and decided to check it out. The desk caught my attention right away. It was solid, made of heavy wood, and looked like it had been around for decades. Even though it was old, it was in decent shape, and the price was almost nothing. The woman selling it, this older lady with gray hair tied up in a bun, seemed uneasy when I asked about it. She stammered something like, it belonged to a relative, wasn't used much, but didn't elaborate. At the time, I just thought she was one of those people eager to get rid of old stuff. After bringing the desk home, I started noticing some weird details. The first thing was the scratches inside the drawers. They weren't the usual wear and tear marks from things being dragged around. They were deep and chaotic, almost like someone had been using a tool to pry at the wood from the inside. Then there was this metallic smell coming from the desk. I thought maybe it was from rusty nails or something. But the smell didn't go away, even after I scrubbed it down with vinegar and cleaner. It wasn't overpowering, but it lingered, especially at night when everything was quiet. Things got really strange a few nights later. I was lying in bed studying when I heard a noise coming from the desk. It was like a faint creaking, the kind of sound wood makes when it expands or shifts. At first, I didn't think much of it. Old furniture makes noises sometimes. But over the next few days, the sounds became more frequent and louder. It wasn't just the wood creaking. The noises started sounding like light footsteps on hardwood floors. A couple of times, I even got up to check, but there was nothing there. I tried convincing myself it was just in my head. What really started freaking me out was when I decided to clean my room over the weekend. I hadn't moved the desk since I set it up, but I noticed marks on the floor around it, like it had been dragged. They were faint but clear, scratches in the varnish leading out from under the desk's legs. That sent chills down my spine. How is that even possible? I live alone, and I know for a fact I hadn't moved the desk since I brought it in. I stood there staring at those marks, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but the longer I looked, the more unsettled I felt. That night, the noises got worse. It sounded like the desk was alive, making small creaks and pops at random intervals. The freakiest part was when I heard something that sounded like light scratching, like fingers gently running across the wood. I froze in bed, my eyes locked on the desk's silhouette. The dim light from my bedside lamp cast shadows across the room, and every time I blinked, I had this weird feeling that the desk had shifted slightly. I couldn't sleep. Every noise coming from that thing made my heart race. The next day, I decided to inspect the desk more closely. I emptied out all the drawers and ran my hands along the inside, trying to see if there was anything unusual. That's when I noticed the metallic smell was much stronger inside one of the drawers. Looking closer, I saw faint dark stains on the wood, barely noticeable but definitely there, like something had dripped and dried a long time ago. It was dry, but the smell was nauseating. My first thought was maybe it was mold or rust, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else entirely. After finding those stains, I couldn't stop thinking about where the desk came from. The uneasiness I'd been feeling about it was growing, and those scratch marks on the floor around it kept haunting me. I went back to the garage sale to try to get more answers, but the old lady who sold it to me wasn't there. Her neighbor, though, seemed to know something. He mentioned that the desk used to belong to the house's previous owner, but then he said something strange. I don't know why she still keeps that stuff. It's like she wants to get rid of it, but never can. I asked him what he meant, but he just shrugged and told me to look up the name of the previous owner online. When I got home, I did exactly that, and what I found made my blood run cold. The desk used to belong to a man named William Hart, who had gone missing years ago. According to the news articles, he was last seen in his home. There were no signs of forced entry, and everything in the house was undisturbed, except the living room, which was in complete disarray, like there had been a struggle. One of the photos in the article showed the desk, the exact same one now sitting in my room. It wasn't just similar, it was the same. The scratches inside the drawers, the worn edges, It all matched. That's when the fear really started sinking in. After reading about the disappearance, every little thing about the desk felt more sinister. That night, I decided I couldn't have it in my room anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about William Hart, about that room he was last seen in, and about whatever might have happened to him. I moved to the couch in my living room, hoping I could finally get some rest. But sleep never came. It felt like the desk's presence was following me, even from a different room. The silence in the house made every sound stand out, and soon enough, I started hearing those creaks again. Only this time, they weren't coming from the desk in my bedroom. The noises were in the living room now, closer. A creak here, a faint dragging sound there, like something heavy being moved across the floor. The couch felt like the worst possible place to be, too exposed, too open. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, determined to see what was going on. My heart was pounding as I crept toward the hallway leading to my room. When I glanced down the hall, I swear I saw something move. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow, low and erratic, just for a split second. I froze, caught between the urge to run and the need to know what was happening. I took a deep breath and forced myself to check the bedroom. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. The desk wasn't in the same spot I had left it. It was now in the middle of the room, turned at an angle I had never placed it in before, like it had been dragged there. The marks on the floor that I'd noticed earlier were now deeper, more pronounced, as if someone, or something, had forcefully pushed it across the room. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me and bolted back to the living room. I grabbed my car keys, deciding right then and there that the desk had to go. I dragged the desk out to my front yard, not caring about the loud scraping noise it made on the floor. All I wanted was to get it out of my house, even if that meant leaving it on the curb. As I tipped it over onto the grass, it fell onto its side, revealing something I hadn't seen before. Underneath, in the center of the desk's underside, there were deep scratches, jagged, circular marks that looked like someone had clawed into the wood. It didn't make any sense, but those scratches sent a chill through me unlike anything else. Without a second glance, I ran back inside and locked all the doors and windows. That night, I stayed awake, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the house was silent, eerily so. The next morning, when I worked up the nerve to look outside, the desk was gone. I don't know if someone picked it up, or if, well, I'd rather not think about the alternative. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I've made one promise to myself. I'll never buy used furniture again. And honestly, I don't even want to imagine what really happened to William Hart, or to that desk. I've always loved saving money and finding good deals, so when I saw a garage sale happening in my neighborhood, I went straight to check it out. My wife and I had just moved into our first house together, and we were trying to decorate it without breaking the bank. That morning, among piles of old stuff and dusty books, I spotted a wall clock that immediately caught my eye. It had this classic, vintage look, kind of like something you'd see at your grandparents' house, with beautifully crafted wood and big numbers. The older man running the sale seemed like a friendly, harmless guy. He mentioned that the clock had a lot of history, but he was downsizing and letting it go. I paid $20 for it and left feeling pretty happy about my find. I hung the clock in our living room the same day, and it fit perfectly with the vibe we were going for. At first, it was just another piece of decoration, nothing special, but a few days later, I noticed something odd. A black car I didn't recognize started parking outside our house frequently. Sometimes it would sit there for hours, and nobody would get in or out. I even mentioned it to my wife, but she thought I was overthinking it. Still, it bothered me, especially because the driver seemed to always be looking toward our house. By the fourth day, the car was really messing with my head. I left for work in the morning, and it was there. When I got back home that night, it was still parked in the same spot. I decided to walk outside and get a closer look, but as soon as I approached the driver, a middle-aged guy wearing sunglasses, started the car and drove off. My heart was racing. Was it just a coincidence, or was I really being watched? I went back inside, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the whole thing left me feeling uneasy. That same night, I was moving things around in the living room and decided to adjust the clock's position on the wall. That's when I noticed something unusual on the back of it. There was a small opening hidden in the wood. At first, I thought it was just a defect, but as I looked closer, I saw a tiny electronic device inside. It looked like a tracker or something, with a small LED light and what seemed to be a microphone. I froze. Why would a wall clock have something like that? And why hadn't the old man mentioned it? The unease I'd been feeling turned into full-blown panic. Holding that device in my hand made my stomach churn. I knew I shouldn't mess with it, but I couldn't help myself. I opened up the clock completely, trying to figure out what was going on. The device looked like something straight out of a spy movie. Tiny wires connected to a battery and a small antenna. At that moment, I started wondering who had put it there and why. I stared at the clock, now in pieces, and regret started to creep in. Maybe I should have just left it alone. The next day, the black car was back. This time, I kept a close eye on it. From behind the curtains, I watched as the driver just sat there, staring straight ahead. After what felt like forever, he picked up his phone and started talking, but I couldn't hear a thing. That's when it hit me. Maybe this had something to do with the clock. Maybe there was something in it that someone wanted. I took the device and stuffed it in a box in the bedroom, thinking it might be best to stay out of it. But what happened next proved that wasn't going to be an option. 2 days later, something I never expected happened. It was around 7 p.m., and my wife had just left to visit her parents. Someone knocked on the door. When I opened it, it was the old man who sold me the clock. He didn't look like the friendly guy from the garage sale anymore. Without wasting any time, he asked if I still had the clock. I was taken aback by the question but answered honestly. Why lie? I told him it was in the living room, and I wasn't planning on selling it back since it fit perfectly in our home. He started insisting, saying he'd made a mistake selling it and needed it back immediately. That clock belongs to my family, he said with a tone that didn't match the words. Something about the way he spoke felt off. His reasoning didn't make sense, and his urgency made me uneasy. I told him no and tried to brush it off, but before leaving, he gave me this strange, almost threatening look and said, "You don't understand what you've got there." That sentence stuck with me, echoing in my head long after he walked away. After that visit, my paranoia kicked into overdrive. It felt like everything revolved around that damn clock. I decided to investigate further and took the device I'd found to a friend of mine who works with electronics. He confirmed my worst fear. It was a tracker with a microphone, the kind of thing you'd expect from professional surveillance equipment. That was enough to convince me that I was tangled up in something way over my head. I brought the device back home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to end easily. That night, around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps in my backyard. My entire body froze. Slowly, I crept to the window and moved the curtain just enough to peek outside. There he was, the old man. But this time, he didn't look like a frail, harmless senior. His expression was dark, and his hands were shaking as he stared at my front door. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my phone and started dialing the police. But before I could hit call, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every tiny sound made my skin crawl. The next morning, I knew I couldn't keep the clock any longer. I packed it up along with the device and stashed them in a storage unit I rented across town. My plan was to get rid of it for good, maybe dump it somewhere far away. But when I returned to the storage unit later that day, the clock was gone. The only thing left on the floor was the tracker, smashed to pieces. It was like someone had been there just to send me a message. When I got back home, I was a nervous wreck. I could barely focus on anything, and every little sound felt like a warning. That evening, I heard a noise outside again. The black car was back. This time, 2 men got out. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but they stood across the street for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, They got back into the car and drove off, but they left something behind on the sidewalk. My curiosity got the best of me, and I ran outside to see what it was. It was the clock. Somehow, it had found its way back to me. To this day, I have no idea how or why. I've always hated clutter, so organizing a garage sale seemed like the best way to get rid of all the junk piling up around the house. I picked a sunny Saturday, set everything up on my front lawn, and even posted an ad online to draw more people. At first, everything went smoothly. Neighbors and strangers stopped by, haggled over prices, and bought stuff I never thought anyone would want. But late in the morning, I noticed him. A thin, slouched man wearing a black beanie, which looked totally out of place in the scorching heat. He didn't seem all that interested in the items. Instead, he kept wandering around, eyeing my house more than the stuff for sale. It felt weird, but I kept helping other customers, trying to ignore the nagging feeling of being watched. Eventually, he came up, picked up an old toolbox, and started asking questions that felt off. "How long have you lived here? Do you live alone?" I kept my answers vague and mentioned my wife would be back soon. Complete lie, I live alone. Then he asked, almost casually, if he could check out any items I might have inside the house. I laughed it off, said everything I was selling was already out on the lawn. He shrugged, put the toolbox back, and walked off slowly, giving one last long look at my front door before leaving. That moment stuck with me all day. Sunday morning started off uneventful, but something still felt off. While watering my backyard, I noticed a car parked across the street. It wasn't a car I recognized, and here's the creepy part. The guy in the beanie was sitting in the driver's seat, watching me. He didn't do anything, just sat there, staring. I pretended not to notice, but when I glanced back a few minutes later, the car was gone. I tried convincing myself I was being paranoid, but later that afternoon, I saw the same car driving slowly past my house. This time, he didn't even try to hide it. It was him again. That's when it started becoming a pattern. He didn't come by every day, but often enough for me to notice. Usually in the afternoons or early evenings, he'd either drive past my house at a snail's pace or park a few houses down and sit there, alone in his car. The more it happened, the more uneasy I felt. I started avoiding being outside for too long, keeping my blinds shut most of the time. Then, on a random Tuesday night, as I went to take out the trash, I found something that made my stomach turn. His black beanie, the same one he wore during the garage sale. It was dirty, lying there in my yard, like it had been thrown there on purpose. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. That's when it hit me. This wasn't my imagination. Someone was definitely watching me. That night, I locked every door and window and tried to lay down, but sleeping wasn't an option. Every little noise made me sit up, convinced someone was outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard something faint, like soft footsteps on the grass. My chest tightened as I grabbed my phone and crept to the living room window. I barely moved the curtain, just enough to peek outside. There, in the shadows, was a figure near my fence. I couldn't make out the face, but it was someone. I froze, clutching the curtain. The figure stood there for a few seconds before slipping into the darkness, as if they'd never been there. The next morning, the unease turned into full-blown fear. I went out to check the yard and found footprints near the fence and one of the latches on my side gate undone. Somehow, it seemed like they tried to get in but got interrupted. I called the police, explained the situation, but they didn't seem too concerned. Probably just some drifter, they said. I installed a makeshift security camera on my front porch and bought a sturdier lock for the gate, but none of it made me feel safer. Being home alone, especially at night, was starting to mess with me. The feeling of being watched was constant, like it was burned into the back of my mind. A couple of days later, I was watching TV when my phone buzzed with a notification from the security camera. My heart sank before I even opened it. When I checked the feed, there he was, standing on the sidewalk right in front of my house. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring directly at the camera. He wasn't wearing the beanie this time, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. It was blank, emotionless, but his eyes, they were unsettling, like he could see straight through me. Before I could react, he turned and calmly walked away, disappearing around the corner. I saved the recording and called the police again, but they just told me to call back if he did anything more serious. That same night, I woke up to a loud thud outside, like something heavy had fallen in the yard. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feed, but nothing showed up. I went to the bedroom window and froze when I saw the garage door slightly open. I knew for a fact I had locked it. Grabbing a kitchen knife with shaky hands, I called the police again and waited by the front door, trying to keep my breathing steady. When the officers arrived, they checked the property but didn't find any signs of forced entry. They told me I must have forgotten to lock it, but I knew that wasn't true. He had been there, and he wanted me to know it. After that night, my routine completely unraveled. I could barely sleep, and every little sound made my pulse race. I decided to install more cameras around the yard and put an extra lock on the garage door. For a few days, things seemed to calm down. No sign of him, no strange noises, nothing. I started to think maybe he'd finally gotten bored and moved on. But one morning, as I stepped out to grab the newspaper, I saw something that sent chills down my spine. A key. It was placed neatly on the doormat, as if left there intentionally for me to find. I didn't recognize it, and that made it even worse. It felt like a message. He wanted me to know that he could get in any time he wanted. That was the last time I had any trace of him. In the days that followed, I stayed hyper-aware, expecting something worse to happen, but it never did. No more parked car, no footsteps in the yard, no camera notifications. Just silence. When I told the police about the key, they didn't even bother to come out. Over time, people stopped asking me about it, and life seemed to return to normal, but I never really moved on. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment. Every time I hear a creak in the house or glance at the front door, the memory floods back, and I can't help but wonder, why did he stop? And more terrifyingly, what if he hasn't? My wife and I love hitting up neighborhood garage sales. We always find unique stuff for cheap. One Saturday morning, we came across this old toolbox. It was rusty, the paint was peeling, and it had dents all over. But there was something about it that caught our attention. The guy running the sale didn't seem to care much about what he was selling. He was just trying to clear out junk. He let us have it for $5. It seemed like the perfect find to display on a shelf in our living room. We didn't think much of it until we got home and opened it up. That's when things got strange. Inside the box were about 10 envelopes. They were old, yellowed, and had water stains, like they'd been sitting in a damp place for years. Curious, we opened the first one and found a Polaroid photo of an abandoned house. Then another, and another. Each photo was of a different house, all in pretty bad shape. Broken windows, overgrown yards, that eerie look of places that had been forgotten. But then we came to the last photo, and it sent chills down my spine. It was our house. The same exterior, but from years ago, before it was renovated. The trees were smaller, and the paint was peeling in the exact same way it looked in the listing photos when we bought the place. My wife and I stared at each other, completely baffled. How the hell did this photo end up in there? That picture stuck in my mind all day. We tried to remember if the guy at the garage sale mentioned anything about the toolbox, but he hadn't said much of anything. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence, I thought at first, but it didn't sit right with me. Out of curiosity, we flipped the photo over to see if there was a date or anything written on the back. There wasn't, just a faint ring, like someone had set a coffee mug on it. We left the envelopes on the table and went about our day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole thing was off. It was like our house had some sort of hidden history we didn't know about. That night, things took an unsettling turn. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound coming from the backyard. It wasn't loud, just soft, crunching footsteps, like someone walking on dry leaves. I lay there for a while, trying to convince myself it was probably just a raccoon or a stray cat, but something about it felt different. I got up and went to the kitchen window, which overlooks the yard. My breath caught when I saw fresh footprints in the dirt. They weren't there before. I was sure of it because I'd mowed the lawn and cleaned up the yard earlier that day. I looked around, but the darkness felt oppressive, like it was hiding something. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come. The next morning, I went straight to the backyard to get a better look at those footprints. They were clear as day, leading right up to the living room window where we had left the envelopes and the toolbox. It was like someone had been standing there, watching. I called my wife over to show her, and we both just stood there, trying to make sense of it. Neither of us could. We decided to check the footage from our security cameras, hoping it would give us some answers. But when we pulled up the recordings, the footage from the night before was corrupted. Coincidence? Maybe, but that only made us more uneasy. We went back inside and decided to take another look at the photos. That's when we noticed something we hadn't seen before. In one of the pictures, there was a faint shadow in the window of one of the abandoned houses. It wasn't a reflection, and it didn't look like a smudge. It was the outline of a person standing there. I showed it to my wife, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. Every photo we examined after that seemed to have something slightly off about it. Little details that felt wrong but were hard to put into words. Deep down, I think we both knew we'd made a mistake bringing that box into our home. But what could we do? Throw it away? Burn it? Nothing felt like the right move. That night, the tension was unbearable. We went to bed early, but I couldn't relax. Every little creak and noise made my skin crawl. Around 1 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were heavier, more deliberate, like someone walking with purpose around the house. I got up quietly and went to the living room window, careful not to turn on any lights. I pulled the curtain back just a sliver, and my stomach dropped. There was someone standing near the fence in the backyard. A figure, motionless, just staring at the house. I froze, not knowing what to do. I ran to wake my wife, and we both peeked out from the bedroom window. The figure was gone. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what was happening. They said they'd send someone over, but while we waited, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps inside the house. Slow, deliberate steps, like whoever it was wanted to make sure we knew they were there. We locked ourselves in the bedroom and sat in silence, barely breathing. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that in my life. While we waited for the police, we stayed locked in the bedroom, barely moving. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound, but everything had gone eerily quiet. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears and my wife's shaky breathing. It felt like hours before we saw the flashing lights of the police car outside. Finally, we felt a small sense of relief. The officers searched the house and the backyard thoroughly, but they didn't find anyone. The footprints were still there, though, clear as day, leading right up to the window where we'd left the photos and the toolbox. I tried explaining everything to the cops, the toolbox, the pictures, the strange events. They gave me this look like they were trying not to roll their eyes. One of them said it was probably just some neighborhood kid messing around, and that we should invest in better security. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't some random prank. Whoever had been here knew something about the box, and about us. After the cops left, my wife and I sat in the living room, exhausted but too wired to sleep. I stared at the toolbox sitting on the coffee table, and I couldn't help but feel like it didn't belong here. Like it was a mistake to bring it into our home. We decided to get rid of it. The next morning, we packed up the box, the envelopes, and the photos and drove them to a dumpster far from our neighborhood. I thought that would put an end to it, that we could finally move on. But that night, as we tried to settle back into some kind of normalcy, we heard it again. A soft scratching sound at the living room window. My stomach dropped. I got up to check, my hands trembling, and when I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. Sitting on the porch was the toolbox, the same one we had just thrown away. The lid was slightly open, and on top of the photos was a new Polaroid. It was our house, taken at night, with the lights on inside.